O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just be over here?
Okay, what is he doing there?
He just drove up again.
He just drove up.
Over.
Wait a minute, what kind of car is he in?
He's in a white Bronco. But first of all, he broke the back door down to get in.
Okay, wait a minute, what's your name?
Nicole Simpson.
Okay, is he the sportscaster or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Wait a minute, we're sending police. What is he doing? Is he threatening you?
I'm going nuts.
Okay, has he threatened you in any way, or is he just harassing you?
You're going to hear him in a minute. He's about to come in again.
Okay, just stay on the line.
I don't want to stay on the line. He's going to beat the shit out of me.
Wait a minute, just stay on the line so we can know what's going on until the police get there, okay? Okay, Nicole?
Uh-huh.
Just a moment. Does he have any weapons?
I don't know.
Okay.
He went home and now he's back. My kids are upstairs sleeping and I don't want anything to happen.
Okay.
Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Gina. Tracy, it's good to be with you.
I think over the years, so many people forget about the domestic violence relationship that Simpson and Nicole had. I remember Denise Brown taking pictures of her sister after she was abused. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The crime scene told us this was a classic example of overkill. This was a rage killing, a very savage killing, over the top. And so what fueled that rage, and that came from, one, a latent violent streak within Simpson. And even apart from domestic violence, we had been able to unearth incidents of violent conduct towards teammates and others over time. So that was always bubbling beneath the surface. But when you couple that with the history of domestic violence committed by Simpson against Nicole, and that's both physical abuse as well as psychological abuse, which went on for years, great amount of hatred and rage, which ultimately fueled that killing. And I think if you look at the events of June the 12th, 1994, stemming from the dance recital and the rejection of Simpson, that is, not being allowed to join the family as he once was able to when he and Nicole were married, when they went to the Mezzaluna, an Italian restaurant nearby. And I personally believe that rejection accelerated an already slow-burning fuse, again, of hatred towards Nicole. Some weeks before the murders occurred, Nicole had very conclusively told Simpson it was done.
We
when it came to the crime scene, what do you think actually happened, in your opinion?
I was not out there immediately, but I certainly didn't have an idea of what it was like. In short form, Gina, I think both victims, Nicole and Ron, were subdued probably within a matter of minutes. It appears Nicole came out of her townhome, leaving the front door slightly ajar because she anticipated Ron was coming over with Nicole's mother's eyeglasses, which had been inadvertently left at a nearby restaurant in Brentwood. It appeared that Nicole was probably subdued rather quickly. She had minimal signs of defense wounds to her hands, but she did have blunt force trauma to her temporal part of her head. It looked like she had been conked on the head, probably consistent with having been struck with the hilt of a knife. It appeared she went down, may have suffered some knife wounds to the neck area, but then it appears at this point Ron came up from it appears Simpson hid in a planter area right next to where Nicole's body was, or the wounded Nicole, and he confronted Ron. Ron struggled. Initially, it appeared that Ron was probably being controlled in some fashion due to some superficial, very superficial neck wounds that were parallel lines, if you will, drawn across his throat. And he had 5 puncture wounds in a star-shaped pattern on the right cheek. So it appears he was likely being taunted, because you simply don't get parallel wounds in a struggle. Simpson was right-handed. Ron, he probably had his left hand around Ron's chest. It appears Ron went for it, pulled the control hand away, pulling a glove off of Simpson's hand, which dropped in the scene. But then the fight was on, and Ron was backed into a planter area with security bars behind him to his side, a tree trunk to the other side. Ron had nowhere to go. He was in a killing cage. Ultimately, he suffered wounds to his upper torso, but one wound to his left flank, a deep penetrating wound into his abdomen, severed his abdominal aorta, which meant Ron was a dead man within a minute, if that. He remained on his feet briefly, bleeding profusely, and then just sunk to the ground. Then the evidence indicates that Simpson moved back to Nicole's inert body, lifted her head by her blonde hair, did a massive stab wound across her neck and up, severing everything in her neck. Jugular, carotids, put a 1/4-inch nick in her C3 vertebrae. So she was gushing blood at this point in time. Drops her head down. Simpson moves back to Ron, wrenches him to the side, and again, targeting the neck, does 4 deep penetrating stab wounds in a very tight pattern to his neck. It was classic overkill in the case of both. And then it appears Simpson simply calmly backed out of the crime scene, his shoes now bloodied because of the pools of blood surrounding Nicole's body, walked away down the side of Nicole's townhome and out to an alley and back where his Bronco was waiting.
Bill, I remember looking at those crime scene photos. They were the first crime scene photos I'd ever seen. This was my first job. And literally going in the bathroom and being sick from looking at them. Compared to other crime scenes, how would you describe this one?
This was the bloodiest crime scene in any murder case I'd ever prosecuted. And up to that point in time, I prosecuted over 40 murder cases, terrible murders, strangulation murders, multiple gunshots. This was the bloodiest, most gruesome crime scene in a murder case that I ever experienced.
After that, you got to know O.J. Simpson very well. How would you describe him?
Simpson was very narcissistic. It was all about him in his daily life. And he adored attention. He demanded attention. Our research into Simpson revealed many, many episodes of where Simpson, being in public, was not immediately recognized, and he would do something to create a scene in order to draw attention to himself. Simpson, of course, was very charismatic, and that charisma influenced how others reacted to him, including law enforcement. And given that, Simpson was accustomed to having preferential or deferential treatment, be it in restaurants, from law enforcement, getting out of speeding tickets, whatever it was. Simpson was accustomed to living a very privileged life.
And that played out in the trial too, correct?
Oh, sure. And part of our strategy, of course, in prosecuting Simpson was to knock him off that iconic pedestal upon which he resided. And Simpson's fame through his sports achievements, Heisman Trophy winner, NFL star, pitchman for Hertz Rent-A-Cars and Orange Juice, and even sort of a mediocre acting career. All of this led, coupled with his charisma, to a very high public profile for himself. And people felt like they knew Simpson, they liked Simpson, and even some focus group works we did prior to jury selection revealed just in such high esteem, which Simpson was held in, and that almost any permutation of evidence would not be enough to erase the fact that people just didn't want to believe Simpson could do it. He couldn't commit murder.
Phil, in the trial, the domestic abuse was brought up. Why did that not resonate with the jurors?
That was an enormous disappointment to us, Gina. Again, part of our strategy was to front load the trial, that is our presentation of evidence, with an attempt to knock Simpson off that iconic pedestal and show, before we even got to evidence of the murder, the dark side of Simpson. And we spent several weeks explaining to the jury the cycle of domestic violence. We presented evidence of numerous incidents, provable incidents of domestic violence committed by Simpson against Nicole, where Nicole was victimized. Simpson, in fact, had been convicted of misdemeanor spousal battery some years earlier. And we had, as Tracy mentioned earlier, there was photographic evidence that we had of Nicole having been battered physically by Simpson, about the face and upper torso. So when we had several jurors excused for misconduct just after several months of trial and after the presentation of the domestic violence portion of the case, we were very much disheartened to learn that those jurors felt that domestic violence had nothing to do with these murders, that, in fact, to borrow almost a football metaphor, some of the excused jurors felt that we, as the prosecution, were unfairly piling on Simpson by seeking to admit such evidence. So there was a disconnect there. There was a cognitive dissonance where it appeared our jury just did not get it.
They didn't want to believe it. I remember, Bill, one of the most important days, or one of the most iconic days of the trial. I was in the courtroom when OJ tried on that glove, and I remember watching it thinking it looks so different than the way it was portrayed on TV, because he was standing pretty closely in front of me, and he was such a large man and a very intimidating presence, even standing up. Tell us about that glove, the decision to try on the glove.
Well, the decision to try on the glove was never really a decision that was planned nor strategized. It should not have happened, quite simply. I do remember that particular day vividly. We had a glove expert from New York on the stand who was explaining to the jury the unique features of these Eris Light size extra large gloves, which were sold exclusively through Bloomingdale's back on the Eastern Seaboard. And the witness was very, very good. My colleague Chris Starton was presenting that evidence, and it was so solid that I felt that personally I could not monitor the proceedings and break away to plan Simpson's cross-examination. And as you might recall, Tracy, I had a team of attorneys and clerks who had dissected Simpson's life, his words in print and video. We had worked with psychologists in terms of how to best cross-examine Simpson.
I remember.
Yeah, and I was in a hideaway office within the criminal courts building. That afternoon, I remember getting paged. This was in the days of pagers. I went to a phone and called Marcia in court, and she said, "All right, we're not trying the gloves on Simpson, are we?" And I said, "Marcia, that's right. We have a game plan. We can inferentially show that those gloves would have readily fit Simpson's hands." And and Marcia goes, "That's it? Okay, fine." At the end of that particular day, I remember it was after 5 o'clock, and I went back to the war room where you spent so much time. And everyone was downcast and looking shattered. And I asked, what happened today? Today should have been a good day for us. And that's when I learned that Chris had asked that the gloves be tried on Simpson's hands, that Judge Ito had said, well, I won't allow that because of HIV concerns. Simpson's going to have to put on latex gloves. So a red warning flare should have gone right up there. Do not do this. Do not do this. Chris was trying for that dramatic moment and did not turn out well. And in effect, it allowed Simpson to testify without even being cross-examined as he stood in front of the jury in close physical proximity, as you saw, Tracy, trying the hands on. He was mouthing the words, they don't fit. It doesn't fit. It's a very dark moment for us in the trial. And practicality, we actually gained from it because following that incident in court, sports photographers went to their archives, even sports photographers whom we had contacted previously, trying to put the gloves on Simpson's hands and the Bruno Magli shoes on his feet. Well, now they responded, and over the coming weeks, we were sent almost 20 photographs of Simpson wearing those very unique gloves. And Judge Ito allowed us to present that to the jury later in the case. Emotionally, though, psychologically, it was a punch to the gut. It hurt, and it resonated far more on an emotional level than it should have. And, of course, it gave rise to the Johnny Cochran's line, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. We actually presented evidence that the gloves did fit, but it was that pithy little slogan that gets remembered, not the fact that we were able to show the gloves actually fit.
So how do you overcome that emotional pit when you still have months and months of trial to go?
Well, if we had a more fair and open-minded jury, we might have had a chance because, again, objectively, we demonstrated that the gloves would have fit. And that should have overcome that bad day at Black Rock Day in the courtroom. However, this just gave our jury, who was predisposed to acquit Simpson anyway, just another hook to hang their hat on, another rationalization where they could say, we don't think Simpson's guilty.
Bill, another memorable day during the trial was when the jury got onto a bus and went to O.J. Simpson's house to do a visit. Tell us what happened that day.
Well, that was a day which contained several what we call jury views. There was actually a drive-by and brief stop at Bundy, and there were one or two other little lesser scenes, I think the Mezzaluna restaurant as well. But the big point of the jury view was to enable the jury to see Rockingham, Simpson's residence. Of course, all of this occurred with a massive media presence, helicopters in the air. Even though the route had been secured by LAPD, there were still media present at many of the key junctures or intersections, all trying to film this. But at the house itself, at Simpson's house, what was apparent right away was that the house had been staged. And there were several things that were very, very different than right after the murders when we had first gone in with search warrants and had photographed the house. The defense had a fire going in the fireplace, making it a very kind of warm and homey type thing. Flower arrangements were scattered around the house. And chiefly, photographs which had been present back in late June of 1994 were now missing. And those photographs included Simpson, usually with bikini-clad contestants in bikini contests, the Hawaiian Tropics bikini contest, for example. And invariably, many of the contestants looked very much like Nicole, white and blonde. And at the landing on the stairs leading from the first floor to the second floor, there was a large Norman Rockwell print, a rather famous painting by Norman Rockwell, which depicts a little African-American girl being escorted, apparently, to school by either a National Guardsman or a state trooper of some sort. When we saw all this was different than the way the scene looked right after the murders. We objected to Judge Ito, and from what I recall, the fireplace was turned off, the flower arrangements were left, as well as all the photographs. And now the photographs of the bikini-clad girls were now replaced by Simpson depicted with his mother and family members. It was actually rather crudely done. There were still nails in the wall along the stairwell from the first floor to the second floor where photographs had been removed. And Judge Ito allowed the Norman Rockwell painting to stay on the wall. And of course, the jurors, as they walked from the bottom floor up to the second floor, looked at all the photos. They looked at the Norman Rockwell painting. And as has been documented in documentaries as well as at least one book, the Norman Rockwell painting came from Johnny Cochran's office. And the defense actually got kind of a kick out of taking that painting the night before from Cochran's office, hanging it on the wall in Simpson's house. And amazingly, one of the defense team attorneys, Carl Douglas, actually copped to doing just that, and they got away with it. So they reached into their bag of dirty tricks on that one.
All right, Mr. Simpson, would you please stand and face the jury? Mrs. Robertson.
Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
So the day of the verdicts, I remember being in the war room, and when the verdicts came out, I remember one of the family members screaming, "What about the babies? What's going to happen to the babies?" Would you describe the verdicts in that day and how it felt for you?
Well, I was in court with Marcia Clark and Chris Darden, and even though the not guilty verdicts were not unanticipated, I still held out hope. The jury was very hard to read. They were very stoic, very stone-faced. But I had been encouraged a little bit by some positive readback the day before from the limousine driver. And so there was a little bit of hope, but it was just hard to tell. When the verdicts were read, personally myself, I remember just going numb. And it seemed like time came to a standstill. And I remember thinking, did I just hear that? Did I just hear a not guilty? And the thing that brought me back to my senses was hearing Kim Goldman, Ron Goldman's sister, behind me and to my right in the audience in the courtroom. And just this anguished cry, this heartbreaking cry coming from her. And I remember thinking, they've done it, they've walked Simpson.
After that, we had a press conference. Do you remember that?
I do. I remember standing there. I don't remember too much about it, in part because I still was disbelieving what I had heard. I guess you might say I was still processing it. And I remember standing there with the DA, Gil Garcetti, and others on the team. I remember going to the war room after that and consoling you, Tracy, and law clerks. And it was just very, very sad. I remember tears, and I remember telling you and others, don't be discouraged from, a career being a public prosecutor. This was an aberrational result. There'll be many, many good days that will come. This one hurts, yes, but there'll be good days.
I remember you saying that. So you sent us all home after the press left, and I remember leaving you there. What happened after that?
Well, I went back to my office, and by this point, it was roughly mid-afternoon, and it was very quiet around my office, almost eerily quiet. I remember looking out the windows and seeing the sun shining, and kind of a disconnect, like how can the sun be shining on a dark day like this? And while I was there, 2 sheriff's deputies came to my office, and they had accompanied the jurors who had been sequestered when the jurors were transported from the hotel where they were sequestered to a sheriff's substation where they were released to family members and loved ones, presumably. And the 2 deputies told me this, and I remember this quite vividly. They said, "Bill, you guys never had a chance. All we heard on the bus ride out to the substation was high fives and cheering, and we did it. And they said, most of all, we kept hearing, That was payback for Rodney King. That was payback for Rodney King. A reference to the acquittal of the 4 white police officers in the infamous Rodney King case, which had been tried about 2 years or so before. And that was just a knife to the heart. It just, how could justice go so awry? And after speaking with the deputies, I remember standing in my office and I didn't know what to do. There always had been 100 things to do. There was never enough time in the previous 16 months, never enough time. And all of a sudden, I couldn't think of anything to do other than go home. So as odd as it seemed to be leaving in the afternoon hours with the sun still shining. And that's when I left the office and headed downstairs.
When you left, I recall you telling a story about a security guard that approached you.
Yes. Another vivid recollection. I took the freight elevator from the 18th floor of the criminal courts building down to the subterranean parking garage beneath the courthouse. And because of some threat issues involving Marsha Clark, Chris Dart, and myself, we were allowed to park where the judges parked, beneath the building, very secure. So I got in my car and I started to drive towards the ramp, which led up to street level. And just to the side of that ramp was a small guard's kiosk. And there was a security guard whom I'd come to know through the many days and nights there at the courthouse. As I approached that little guard kiosk, he motioned to me to stop. And I stopped and rolled down my window, and the guard came over to talk to me. And I recall him saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You guys worked so hard. You didn't deserve this. He repeated that several times. And I remember telling him, I said, sometimes this happens. Sometimes justice gets derailed. We've just got to, pick up the pieces and move on. Get back on the horse and ride. Just got to deal with it. And the guard looked at me and he said, Bill, I've never told you this, but my own daughter was murdered some time ago. And I asked the guard, well, what happened? And he said, well, back in what would have been around the early 1970s, around the time the courthouse was being opened, he said, I lived in East LA and a bullet that was meant for someone else in a gang shooting struck and killed my daughter. And they caught the shooter, and he said, LAPD investigated, and he said it was one of the first murder cases prosecuted in the criminal courts building in downtown LA. And I asked the guard, I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, as fate would have it, the shooter was acquitted. The jury let him go, and there were some issues in the case. He said, just like there were some issues with your case, but there were some issues in the case, the jury let him go. And he went on to say he had some friends from East LA, he said, who were, kind of pretty rough guys, and they came to him and said, just give us the word, we'll take care of that guy. And I remember pausing and thinking, oh boy, I'm not sure I want to hear this. And anyway, the guard looked at me and said, I told those guys, no, don't do anything to him. The hand of God is on him. He'll take care of it. And at that point, the guard leaned on the car door. I remember he put his hands on the car door and looked down at me. And he said, Bill, the hand of God is on OJ. You watch. And I remember kind of a chill running up and down my spine. It was one of those moments that I thought, this is just one of those profound moments I'm going to remember forever, because it just had the feel of a prophecy almost. And with that, I left and went home. And quite ironically, 13 years to the date of the acquittal of Simpson was convicted in a Las Vegas courtroom for a robbery effort and was subsequently sent to prison. But 13 years to the date.
It's incredible it was the same date. Incredible.
On September 16th, 2007, O.J. Simpson and some friends were arrested for breaking into a hotel room in Las Vegas and stealing sports memorabilia. O.J. was found guilty on 12 counts, including robbery, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and possession of a deadly weapon, a gun. Simpson served 9 years in prison before he was released in 2017.
One of the things I learned the most from you was the relationships with the victims and how important as a prosecutor it is to never forget who you're fighting for. and what the case is about. And you did a beautiful job reminding us of that all the time. Do you still talk to the Goldmans or the Browns?
I've talked to the Goldman family more so over time. And of course, the pain felt by the Goldman family was so much more readily apparent. And Fred, Patty, Kim Goldman spoke with them a lot, and their pain was just palpable. And of course, that's just a huge motivator for us to want to bring them the best measure of justice that we can. The Brown family, their reaction was a little bit different because they had the close ties with Simpson. They knew him at various levels. They suspected or otherwise knew that Nicole was in an abusive relationship with Simpson, but they were more entangled with Simpson. And I can remember Nicole's father telling me at one point that Simpson always gets away with it, just by virtue of his fame and celebrityhood. He had just seen too many times that Simpson got away with things that us mere mortals, us uncelebrated mortals, would never get away with, but that Simpson did. I could be wrong, but I suspect at least for Nicole's parents, deep down, they might have worried that Simpson would get away with it once again. He wouldn't be held accountable.
Bill, you've seen a lot of terrible things throughout your career, and the crime scene of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman, that's a perfect example of trauma and tragedy that you've seen. I'm curious, how do you get through that? Do you compartmentalize it? What is your process of getting through the trauma and the tragedy that you've seen throughout the decades of your career?
Gina, I do compartmentalize it. It's something that just happens. I go into this analytic mode, and I be in crime scenes where the bodies are still on the ground and the wound's still fresh and the blood spatters all around. I did go into this sort of clinical mode of trying to analyze what occurred. Would I view autopsy photographs much the same? It doesn't bother me in a way, but when I step back sometimes, or in the past, particularly in the case of a child murder, it will affect me. It goes beyond something clinical into something that's more gut-wrenching.
How did the O.J. Simpson case change your life?
Well, as you know, I continued on with the DA's office. So professionally, I had no desire to leave the DA's office. I wanted to get back to the profession that I loved. And as you probably heard many prosecutors say, it's more than a job. It's a calling. And I, throughout my entire career in the DA's office, always derived a great sense of satisfaction in doing my job and doing it as well as I could. And it meant more to me than the money that private practice offered. It provided me just with a very deep sense of satisfaction in terms of doing something that hopefully bettered society and inured to the public safety. I simply continued on, wiser. The verdicts themselves remain a wound, which, while heavily scarred over, still remains a wound. To this day, I have regret that we were unable to bring that measure of justice to the Brown family and the Goldman family. But it tried to learn from the experience, and in turn have tried to teach others in the prosecution business or law enforcement about lessons to be learned from the case, so that there's at least some slight silver lining to the otherwise dark cloud.
There's so much silver lining in you teaching people, because for the last 23 years as a DA, I've told people that if you look up prosecutor in Wikipedia, it should have Bill Hodgman next to it, because you embody what a prosecutor is. You're so ethical and you never forget about the victims. And what advice would you give 25-year-old you that you've learned from this beautiful career?
Well, I've counseled many a young lawyer is to find something that you are passionate about. And for me, the passions were two, really. One was trial work. I wanted to be in court. I wanted to be trying cases. And the second strand, interwoven with the first, was I wanted to represent the people. I had briefly worked in private practice and represented some large corporate clients. And I knew at the time there would always be legions of young lawyers who would want to take my place representing some of the corporate giants, but not everybody would want to stand up for the people and try often difficult cases. But that's what I wanted to do. That's what I was passionate about. So my advice to young lawyers is find out where your passion lies and pursue it, and you'll have a happy career.
Thank you for sharing that passion with me and so many others over the years, Bill. You've made such a difference.
Tracy, thank you very much. As always, you warm my heart. So thank you.